when we have such an erudite guest addressing us, Dr. Palanivel Thiaga, fondly called as PTR, I took liberty in rechristening the title to COVID-19 Crystal Ball Gazing, Economic and Globalization Impact. If there's somebody who can gaze the crystal ball and predict it almost to the T, in my view, it could be Dr. PTR. This statement is largely coming out from our experience and interactions we have in the past with Dr. PTR. Further, one significant feature of Dr. PTR is his obsession towards data, which also acts as an empirical evidence to substantiate his reasoning for all his prediction. Therefore, we had no second thoughts, and we wanted him to gaze the crystal ball on the implications that COVID-19 is going to leave behind. With the IMF terming this as pandemic, as a great lockdown, and if one were to go by the report yesterday, predicting that this great lockdown is worse than the Great Depression, it does send some shivers down the spine. Therefore, with so much of uncertainty and enigma surrounding us, we at the lab felt it would be appropriate to bring in Dr. PTR to listen to his inputs. So therefore, without taking any further time, I leave the floor to Dr. PTR for his erudite views on the implications that the ongoing Black Swan event is going to leave behind. So just a small housekeeping announcement. Unfortunately, we will not be able to see PTR's video. This is due to some technical glitch troubleshoot. This is the first time we are, by the way, using this platform because we wanted to move from the existing platform due to privacy issues. Despite few test runs, unfortunately, we're unable to solve the video glitch. We extremely apologize for it, but I'm sure his oratory abilities will offset the video loss. I leave the floor to Dr. PTR.
Thank you, Sudarshan. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, very much.
Okay, good. I'm a bit kind of overwhelmed and daunted by the introduction because this is one of those situations where Kundera's statement applies in droves. We're all kind of groping in the dark, and so almost nothing we think is accurate or is kind of telescopic sight is likely to come true. I think the most classic indication of that is how much the world looks different, say, week to week, in terms of the data we get on infections and the impact country to country, the variations we're seeing. And an institution as kind of well-empowered and historically data-rich as the IMF has changed its prediction so dramatically between the January prediction and the April prediction. And even now, the three predictions that they lay out, the three scenarios they lay out, are so dramatically different from each other. It's a bit like shooting in the dark. But to the extent possible, I'm trying to combine the two things that I have a little bit of a luxury about. One is my few decades as an expatriate and kind of a very heavy traveler around the world as a banker and as a consultant. And the other, and that was about 25 years, starting in the late 80s. And the other as an MLA, very local, very focused on my constituency of about 2.5 lakh voters, 3 lakh residents, very tiny square in the city of Madurai. So I'm kind of looking at it from both perspectives, from an overall global perspective and a very granular kind of my constituents. What does it mean for them, and what can I do to make their lives better? I think Sudarshan said it best. Almost no comparison that we can make. In previous conversations, I've talked about why this is nothing like 9/11 or nothing like the 2008 crisis, or even quite not the same as the demonetization crisis we faced. But since it's a very, now it's not that rocket science. I said this, I don't know, on March 23rd or 24th. Now I think it's very clear to everybody, and the data has shown us that. So there's no point going over that again. I think it's also worth noting in passing that even from a health comparison, nothing we have seen in recent kind of decades, not the H1N1 crisis, not the bird flu, none of these, or the first SARS, none of these has had the impact nearly what we have seen on this one. And so I kind of accept the IMF's perspective that this is definitely the greatest recession globally since the 1920s, the Great Depression, possibly worse. And in fact, if we were to take the markets as an indication, putting on my old hat, the markets have reacted more dramatically in terms of both the extent of fall and speed of fall, both at the global level and at the Indian level in this crisis than the data shows what happened in the late 20s and early 30s. On the health side, it also might be worth thinking back to the last kind of massive disruption globally, which again, ironically, was around 1919, 1918, after the First World War. And a sobering thought that a country like India lost between 5 and 6% of its population in that crisis. So, everything we say is best guess with very little light and very little data. First, let's look at the reality of what we know about the spread, the hospitalization, and the kind of death rates. So far we've seen such disparate data because the speed of the spread has been so high that the rate of testing has been so disparate and the nature of the testing has been so disparate. So if you take a country like South Korea, because they caught it early and started testing early, they were testing, tens of thousands a day. And so by the time they tested millions of people, the infection rate was very low. Whereas if you take Italy, by the time they started testing, it was already so widespread that their positive test rate was something like 13, 15% at its peak. It's gone down a bit now. So even the sample, those of us who remember our statistics from kind of high school or undergraduate classes, the whole validity of using a sample and the outcome of that to extrapolate to the population is lost if your sample starts out being conflicted and confounded and not independent and not random to start with. So, in light of all this, I would say we are completely in the dark, but we do have some benchmarks, at least in India. We must not forget that India's crude death rate is somewhere around 7 per thousand people. So in an average year, about 700,000 people pass away in India, various reasons, much like the rest of the world, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, those kinds of things. But also, let's not forget road injuries, accidents, homicide, crimes, those kinds of things. So if we put the numbers at a gross level, India last year, statistically, at around 7 per thousand means we lost almost a crore of people. So we lost, 10 million lives in India last year. That all works out to about 25, 26,000 people a day. And Tamil Nadu at about 500,000 for the year is about 1.35 thousand. So about 1,400, 1,300 a day. If we just think about that in context, that means over a 60-day or 70-day period, we're looking at, several lakhs in India and, about 80, 90,000 in Tamil Nadu. Just for benchmark, I mentioned this because the death rates that we are seeing are in the, teens or in the single numbers. I am the first guy who has been harping for about 2 weeks saying these numbers are not only are they meaningless, they are largely kind of suppressed. There was a BBC documentary, a little news clip yesterday that showed in Mumbai alone, in one case, there were 6 people brought dead, all of whom showed symptoms that would have otherwise been considered COVID, but who were buried or cremated without doing any testing because of the shortage of kits. So I have been harping for a long time that the government ought to be studying hospitalization and death rates by reason, by cause. And even, places like easily fudgeable places like sudden respiratory illness and, organ failure and things like that should get lumped back to potentially from COVID. And that would give us a better idea because hypothetically, were we to say that the effective fatality rate was something like 1%, I think our response to this crisis would be something dramatically different than if it was something like 5%. Even that range of 3% to 5% of those infected. I'm not talking about the population, just of those infected. So without having a handle on not just the spread, but the severity and the consequences of the spread, I think we're shooting in the dark. My own estimate, just from the data I have and from the kind of material I've been reading 6, 8 hours a day, is that the actual spread is probably 50 to 100 times what we think it is. And that's still an irrelevantly small number in a country the size of India, which means that the hospitalization rate is probably, very, very small. It's probably 5 to 10 times the numbers that are reported, and even that is very, very small. And then the fatality rate, let's say it's somewhere around 10x or 20x what they're reporting to us, is still probably less than the lives that have been saved by not having activity, by people not being on the road, not having accidental death, the reduction in pollution, etc. So be that as it may, we are on a path. The path is total lockdown, at least as far as India is concerned, slowly lifting in some states, not so in other states. At a global level, different countries are at different stages, different states are at different stages. I would say the first thing this whole crisis has taught us is that one size doesn't fit all at any level. You take a country the size of India, of 1.3 billion, with such great diversity in migrant workers, in foreign connectivity, in nature of work, in availability of healthcare, and all that. The notion of setting up a policy at a nationwide level, if there was any question of whether that would work or not, I think this crisis has shown us that it's completely untenable in any kind of stress situation. But we must also think back and say, how do we analyze the longer term implications of this? So why don't I go maybe short term, medium term, long term, kind of, as I say, just crystal ball gazing, right? We're all, again, estimating. In the short term, I think the real question is how big will the consequences of this be economically in different parts of the world? And what are the tools we have to kind of alleviate the consequences? So, really, in the short term, you have two choices: fiscal policy and monetary policy. I would say that places like the US and then some of the other countries, the monetary policy has, if anything, been too strong, too fast, in my opinion. If we learned anything from the '08 crisis, it was that monetary policy is a very ineffective tool. The consequences of monetary policy, the power of monetary policy has been kind of removed. The policy's potency has been removed, almost emasculated by such great inequalities in the world and such great fluidity of the movement of capital that no central bank in the world, no country in the world achieves anywhere near what it thinks it wants to when it tries to kind of support markets or assets or valuations or whatever. Whatever the intentions are, the outcomes are very far different from the intentions. We've learned that. I was actually quite shocked to see the speed at which the Federal Reserve has increased its balance sheet and is even going further and doing things like, propping up the high yield bond market by buying high yield ETFs. So to me, I'm actually shocked. I worry that monetary policy has gone way too far, too fast. And monetary policy was already a blunt tool to start with and was not able to achieve outcomes that were near intentions. Just as a benchmark, in the '08 to kind of 13, 5 years, most of the OECD central banks, in my estimation, and what statistics I've read, pumped out somewhere around $4 or $4.5 trillion of excess liquidity into the system. More than 3 trillion of that flowed out of these markets into the emerging markets and into Asia, Africa, Middle East markets where I worked. Now, the kind of retrenchment of that in the taper tantrum was quite aggressive and huge negative impact. But still, it just goes to show that policymakers can't control where the liquidity goes. Fiscal policy, on the other hand, again, we've seen a huge range of responses. We see in places like India where barely nothing has moved. The alleged kind of 0.8% of GDP that was announced. Some of it was repetitive, some of it has become infructuous. For example, raising the rates of MNREGA work is pointless when the hours worked has dropped to zero, effectively zero. So you multiply a greater hourly rate by 0 hours, and you get no stimulus at all. So I think the fiscal policy, India was among the lowest. We have seen huge numbers in places like the US, 10% of GDP in the first tranche, 15% in places like the UK. Now, to some extent, if you're an OECD country and your economy is doing fairly well, and especially if you're the US and you can print your own currency and it's the global standard, maybe you have the luxury of raising your debt levels by crazy amounts and not having, long-term consequences. But places like India, we are very constrained, and I think, I actually think there's a solution to it. But for now, I think though it needs to be stepped up a lot, I don't see places like India or other emerging markets having anywhere near the firepower from a fiscal policy perspective as some of the OECD countries have shown. So in the short term, it's very clear to me that this is going to be a devastating crisis economically. I mean, as a ground connect MLA, I find the number of people who are struggling for food is increasing daily. And every incremental day of lockdown and every incremental, what can I say, pay cycle that is missed for those who are paid daily, some are paid weekly, some are paid monthly, increases their burden. Most people in my constituency and in our country, in my opinion, my estimation, did not have built-in cushions. Now, some states have better kind of, public distribution systems and basic supplies than others, but we've never really tested the quality of these public distribution system stocks. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of malfeasance that goes on in these things. And what the books say and what is really available on the ground are two different things. We've never had to really stress test these numbers because, we've just not had to dip into reserves. For example, the Food Corporation of India is apparently sitting on, 30 million tons or something like that, or 30, some gross number. But how do you test the quality of those, right? I mean, the stocks have been accumulating for so long that it's hard to say whether those are good or not. In Tamil Nadu, at least, we're seeing some of the stuff being given out in the public distribution shops. Incidentally, Tamil Nadu stocks were not enough. We had to get imports that we had calculated earlier as part of my team's research. The stocks that were in stock and being distributed were of such poor quality because they were just dregs left over for accounting purposes. So, the economic consequences are going to be huge, and with every passing day, they're going to be worse. And really, the question then is very simple. How soon can we return to normal? If there's such a thing as normal, let's even call it a new normal. How soon do we get out of this and come to something like a new normal, and ideally a normal that's as close to the old normal as possible? And one way that I've tried to think about it is to separate the entire kind of psychology of individuals into kind of a binary tree twice. The first is those who are informed and those who are not informed. Those who understand what the risk is, those who understand what the spread is, those who know what they're in their area or in their district or in their town, what is the actual prevalence, things like that. And my best guess is that many do not, because most governments, including Tamil Nadu in India, have not brought up a system, or at least have not communicated a system throughout the country, which would give people a clearer assessment of their local risk. So, if there's the first division of people into the informed and the uninformed, then there's a second division within each of these, which is, do you have the luxury of choice or do you not? A guy like me, other than the political consequences of not being active in the field, I can indefinitely stay indoors. I don't need to make money. But many, many people don't have that luxury, and that goes all the way up to small business owners, medium-scale business owners, leverage companies, salaried employees, and so forth. So, knowing is one thing. Just because you know whether you can act on it is another thing. And so, I won't bore you with minutiae, but I'm sure, we've all read the reports. I've read the IMF report. I've read the McKinsey reports. I've read the BCG reports. I've read the KPMG report. These are all, luckily in a time of stress like this, free to everybody. And you can see they've gone through sector by sector and all of these things. But the kind of trenchant observation I heard was a hedge fund manager in New York who said, listen, when does it get back to normal? It gets back to normal when either you have 100% confidence that there's herd immunity and you don't have any other problem, which means with the realistically with the vaccine, otherwise there's no way to get to that point. Or if you feel like the risk is so low because the consequences of getting it are easily manageable, and you have less than a 1% chance of being hospitalized and a 0.1 chance of going fatality or whatever, like a normal flu season. So unless we get to one of those two, you're not going to get back to normal, because just because they open the shops, is everybody going to rush back? Just because the planes start flying again, are people going to be comfortable being packed into a recycled air kind of canister for hours at a time? So I think any way we look at it, I don't even know what the new normal is going to be in the short term. Maybe in the medium term, if we reach that point of herd immunity or vaccine, which I assume we will, everything has a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe the medium term thing takes 6 months or a year, who knows? Or maybe we need to have more lockdowns in the middle, maybe we don't. But I'll just talk about two things that I've been thinking about just to get the conversation going, and then I'll finish up. The two things I've been thinking about is, what does this mean for the whole notion of globalization? And I'll go a little bit into detail on that. And the second thing is, what does this mean in terms of the fundamental kind of structure of our society? Things like inequality, things like democracy. What does it mean for that? So if I look at globalization first, I think it was already the case that there was a kind of anti-globalization backlash that had been building, in my opinion, largely built on the kind of increasing inequality. Now, I think it's beyond debate for anybody who's seen either the math or the economics or the empirical data that great innovation, great optimization like massive globalization always leads to spurts in growth rates and creation of global wealth and GDP. It almost always increases inequality as well, because there's no way that anybody's proactive enough, and the system, even in a democracy, is game towards those who have lobbying the powers that be and tilting the scales in their favor. So the last 10 or 15 years of globalization have clearly increased the global growth rate, have also clearly increased the global inequality. At least across, within a country, if not across countries. And I think the thing to remember is that globalization is not a one-way kind of trend. We might think it in our lifetimes, but if you look far enough back, there have been periods when the world was very much more integrated. Just going back when the Roman Empire covered much of the earth, for example, or for that matter, the British Empire or the colonial periods, or for that matter, when America was kind of dominating Japan, Philippines, etc. So, there were different periods in time when the globalized kind of economy had greater sway, and then it became more localized, and barriers came up and things came down, volumes came down. The unique feature of our era of globalization has been not only that every cycle gets more and more efficient and more leveraged because of technology, because of ease of travel, because of wire transfers, because of infrastructure, etc., but also that in our case it got so hyper because really we were no longer talking about globalization of goods, which I suppose was the original globalization, then globalization of capital, which was second, globalization of services, which really couldn't come around till we had kind of good internet connectivity. But realistically, in the last few years, a few decades, I would say, I remember how hard it was to go and how few of us used to go as immigrant students or expats, back in the late 80s, early 90s when I went, and how much easier it's now and how many more people go now. So really, it was globalization of labor markets that was kind of unprecedented because of ease of travel and adaptability and the mindset that allowed these kinds of things. So from that perspective, this is going to be such a shock to the overall variability of, overall growth of globalization, because we can see the goods coming. We can see that already there were trade wars and there were barriers and there was going to be some import substitution and self-reliance, and these things are going to trigger that. We can see, that the services industry especially when you have what you've seen now, which is that people who had outsourced a lot of call center work to places where, again, you can't have people come in together to service. You're going to see some reversal of that. But what I think is amazing, I've just been contemplating it as a human being. If I had been stuck as an expatriate in some country, and if I had wanted to get back, or heaven forbid, somehow I had lost my job, the consequences are just mind-boggling. So, you forget about migrant workers and the low end of the spectrum. They were always at greatest risk, and we have never really understood the extent of kind of weakness in their lives and the lack of security in their lives. That has been exposed in this crisis. But at a global level, think about the hundreds of thousands of expats that are stuck all over, not able to go home, not able to continue where they are, otherwise considered the upper end of society, high income, high qualifications, high mobility, who are now going to suddenly find themselves at greater risk than, let's say, a middle class, clerical worker in their hometown. So I think this thing is going to change a lot of people's perspectives and the structure of globalization and the trajectory of it quite dramatically. And we are still in the early days. As far as goods and capital and things like that, of course, in some way, there's a kind of silver lining for places like India and the US, which were 58, 60, 63, 65% domestic consumption driven. So sooner or later, we'll have to figure out how to do, more within border production and things like that. But we are not that globally kind of exposed to start. A place like China, on the other hand, is. And in theory, were there to be a significant fall off in trade, let's say 2 to 3 times the fall off in GDP, which is usually the leverage between trade and GDP, then places like China should see great impact. But then again, who knows? We've already heard of the story of China kind of starting to buy stakes in companies in India and other places. We have seen the story play out in the past too, when there was a big anti-Japan backlash in the kind of 90s. Japanese companies started going and buying up assets and productive and kind of hard assets, shares and buildings and whatnot have you, Rockefeller Center and so forth in places like the US. So, it's hard to kind of do a first order, second order, third order consequence of these with such little data and not knowing what the time frame of these things are. But I think really it will all depend on how soon we get back to anything close to an old normal, whatever, and how close the new normal is to the old normal before we can look at something like this. Which then the last point I'd like to kind of think about is what does this mean, in terms of the way we live and the structure of our society? I would say that especially the way monetary policy has become completely useless, other than capitalizing profits and socializing losses. The level of inequality has risen to such great heights that I would be shocked if somewhere around the system this was not a leveling. I've been reading a lot about the previous disasters, and they talk about the Black Plague, which led to such a reduction in the number of people available for work that the earning ability and the ability to demand and negotiate wages shot up for workers, and the rents to the lands and the landlords dropped a lot. And so it brought in a huge, era of equalization. So it's too early to say what's going to happen here, but my guess is that there should be some trend towards greater equality, either out of conscience or out of the market. There should be some movement for that. In some sense, spending 10 or 15% of your GDP as a stimulus, ideally, and most places targeted towards the low end, is somewhere along those lines. Finally, I think from the nature of democracy, increasingly, in the US, in India, to some extent in the UK, in Europe, in some places like Hungary, in South America and Brazil, we had started to see the rise of kind of authoritarian, one person takes all decisions, there's no kind of check and balance kind of power. And I think this kind of crisis brings into stark relief the consequences of that. If we were to go all the way back to kind of the philosophy of democracy and other means of government, or Plato's concept of a benevolent dictator, If such a thing existed, I suppose that's an ideal outcome. You have somebody who's so well informed and so compassionate and so effective and so brilliant. It's better than having the noisy consensus making kind of democratic process. But since that's almost, not almost, since it's effectively impossible to achieve, the nature of democracy in its various forms around the world requires checks and balances precisely because no human being is perfect. No human being is omniscient. No human being is kind of, all contained. And so democracy required a much more participative system with the different branches of government playing roles and the different kind of institutions doing their respective jobs. And almost all of that was in decay, at least in my assessment, all over the world. Everything was becoming centralized. The courts were becoming kind of mute, and power was getting concentrated. I think the negative consequences of concentration of power in one hand, especially in many cases deeply limited or unscientific or single track mind hands, is plain for all to see. And so, I'll end as I started, that if this crisis tells us anything, it says that we need more thoughts, more people, more variability, more responsiveness based on local conditions, based on differences in demographics, differences in resistance, differences in climate conditions, whatever it is. We need to be a much more humanitarian, focused on greater equality and greater kind of self-determination for people, with decision making closer to the people. And I hope that that will happen as one of the kind of reset effects of this great crisis. So I apologize. I had not intended to speak so long, but I'll stop now and take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pitya, for your views. We have a few questions. Economic alliances, is India poised to gain in the recovery period?
Yeah, listen, it's hard to see. It's hard for me to say because again, I don't know what India's capacity is. Let's assume, that you have to have two parts of the equation. First is you have to have the opportunity. The opportunity certainly existed for, in my understanding, the opportunity existed for over a year, maybe 2 years, ever since the U.S.-China trade wars have started, and the U.S. has been imposing tariffs on China, and vice versa. There was a huge opportunity for somebody like India to get in the middle. As part of my normal tours around the state, I have talked at some CII and Chamber of Commerce type events where I know individuals who have actually benefited, people in the textile business who were able to find that gap where they were not competitive before, but at a tariff on China, they were competitive, had set up sales offices and were contemplating setting up factories in the US. But this is a whole different ballgame because certainly the opportunity may arise, but what does it say about the kind of capacity? If we are shut down and we can't get people to work, and if our migrant labor kind of go away and don't come back, a lot of these industries are directly or indirectly powered by migrant labor, right? You take just a comparison, just for immediate comparison. Take a place like Tamil Nadu on one hand and Bihar or Orissa on the other. We are net labor short by millions of jobs, and people in Bihar and Orissa are net jobs short by millions of people. So we had a nice kind of mutual benefit association going on. Now, how many of these people are going to be of the mindset that they are still comfortable working? How many can afford to after not having been paid wages? How many who want to get home are going to be emotionally scarred and say, do I really want to take this risk again? So I can't tell where our capacity will end up. The opportunity certainly existed before, and some version of it, I don't know, less or more, will certainly exist in the future. Because there will be, at some level, at least a diversification trade. Even if the overall globalization impetus goes down, it cannot go to zero. And those who have concentration of risk in places like China will certainly try to diversify their risk, their sourcing risk. But I can't tell the other half of the equation really at this point.
All right. So just piggybacking on this particular question, my 2 cents to it is we're happy to listen to your views as well. More than the threat competition for middle economies like India, Vietnam, I think one particular aspect which I see is the states competing for it. The states gearing up for taking up new investments. As a state politician, what is your take on it? Are states gearing up, irrespective of how the nodal work, how the center works? Do you think the states have the wherewithal or the abilities to attract devoid of the center policies?
Actually, states have been hamstrung for quite a while now, right? In two ways. Though the Constitution of India starts by saying India is a union of states, the actual decision making power in states has been continuously reducing. I say this apart from politics. I'm saying from the Congress, UPA governments on till now. It may have accelerated under this government, but it was a trend going on from the beginning. So, going back to the 42nd Amendment in 1970s during emergency, where certain subjects were moved out of the state list and into the concurrent list, there has been a general kind of decaying of states' ability to act or to manage their own finances. GST is another case in point. So, of course, at some level, you cannot kind of constrain states from acting on some things like nutrition and school education and stuff like that. But there are limits based on finances. The center now is the collector of the bulk of our finances under GST and has to remit it to us. If they collect it and don't send it to us, what happens? We're stuck. So I think this crisis highlights something that was a festering kind of wound. Actually, worse than that, it was a time bomb waiting to explode, in the sense that the northern states are deprived of proportional representation because their populations have been growing like crazy, but we haven't readjusted the seats in parliament since 1976. The southern states have been giving up money like crazy, putting out a dollar, getting back 50 paisa, then 30 paisa, putting out rupee, getting back 50%, then 30%, then 20%. So this system is broken. We need to find a way to devolve more decision-making power to the states. And if so, then the states can act. Already we can see great variations in which industries are strong in which states. What is the average education level? What is the per capita income level? What is the kind of access to higher education? All these are different. But if anything, it's I think this kind of trend that was accelerating towards stripping individuality from the states and making it homogeneous across the country was a dangerous trend, and this crisis has shown that. Just think about the last 30 days. I ask all of you, in the last 20 or 30 days, where has the action been? Is it that every state is doing something different, or is it that the center is doing something? I mean, there are structural problems people don't realize. I can sit in Delhi and write whatever logic or idea I like. But the problem is that the center has maybe 25 or 30 lakh government employees. The government of Tamil Nadu has some 15 or 18 lakh employees. I cannot even do what, that means the country of India has twice the number of office bearers and employees that the state of Tamil Nadu, which is about 6% of the population and 9% of the GDP has. How many policies can I affect from Delhi? I still have to come back to the states to affect the policies. In fact, I have to come to the corporation workers who are the voter list validators, who are the enumerators of the census. They are not even state employees directly. They are corporation employees or teachers. So, the scale of our country is such that if you separate the decision-making power to somebody who sits in Delhi and the execution work to somebody who sits in Madurai or a village in Madurai district, you are going to find huge gaps between intent and execution, especially because the environment is so different from place to place. So I think this crisis has shown that first starting with health and certainly then going to economy and jobs and education, you have to enable the states to be more proactive. They're closer to the ground, and one size doesn't fit all. Different states have different needs, and the local governments need to make those decisions.
Given the intolerance of the financial markets to developing country fiscal deficits, how far can we go with the stimulus? 5 to 6% of GDP? His follow-up question to that is, how do we finance it? Can you wear your banker's hat and advocate monetizing the deficit given its potential impact on currency?
Yeah, actually, to me, I'm the great luxury of having spent 20, 25 years on Wall Street and then in Singapore, which was a small fraction but still a highly liquid market. Money is just money, right? Finance is a confidence business. Nobody puts money today, gets it out tomorrow. The stock of debt in the world keeps on growing. The stock of assets in the world keeps on growing. The stock of equities in the world keeps on growing. We are all in a perpetual machine. There are no end days where you cash out and get out. Right? The whole notion of finance is that the wealth keeps getting circulated between the savers, individuals, or their agents as funds and whatever, to the users, which is governments and companies. So I don't really see this as kind of a closed loop game, right? I think anything is possible. What you need is to inspire confidence. If you inspire confidence, the world is awash with money. The Federal Reserve alone has pumped out, I know, trillions of dollars in the last 4 weeks, right? A country like India, we are looking at billions of dollars worth of increased borrowing. We're not looking at anywhere near tens of billions, maybe not even $100 billion. So if you say at the global level, is there liquidity? If your name is good, there's liquidity. I used to be a commercial paper trader, right? If your name is good, you can borrow overnight money. At one point, General Electric Capital Corporation was borrowing $85 billion on a weighted average life of 7 days, unsecured commercial paper. So, of course, when the crisis hit, all of a sudden everybody wanted cash out. They tapped all the bank facilities. And then, it came down after the regulators put it down to some 20 or something. It's probably lower than that now. But in the heydays, I'm talking about 2000, 2001. So it's not the access to money is the problem. It's the confidence you inspire about the quality of your policy, the strength of your vision, your attention to detail, how meticulous are you, how believable is your story of how you're going to finance your debt, what you're going to do to show that you're responsible, you cut down your wasteful expenditures, leverage the returns on your ongoing investments, and explain to the market why you are going to do what you're going to do and how that's going to yield results. I think the money is there. I don't think there's a hard number. What I worry about is you do something that spooks the markets, and then you end up getting a ratings downgrade, and then you end up getting, a lot of investment grade buyers exiting because they have rules. It's not discretion. Once you've gone down to junk, they have to exit you. All of a sudden, you find a vicious cycle where, the pool of money available to invest in investment grade in normal markets is 3 or 5 times or 10 times the money available to invest in junk. Now, of course, the world has got a glut of assets, glut of liquidity. So maybe that's not the case now. But in normal circumstances, when I remember my banking days, falling from investment grade to high yield, the biggest problem you have is the liquidity goes down. Everybody sells and they can't buy you anymore. So to me, it is about a consistent policy. And I hate to say this, but it's true. A lot of finance is also about the messenger, not just the message. If you have people who have qualifications, a track record, a kind of a credible face to the market sitting at the table, you're likely to get a much better response than somebody who cannot make that communication. Every trade in the world is based on human relationships to some degree. So I'm not as worried about absolute numbers. I'm worried about the extent of thoughtfulness, the credibility, the ability to sell it, the faces that will develop it and sell it. That's what I worry about in terms of trying to determine the quantum.
Got it. Slightly digressing, getting into the virus, the pandemic issues. A couple of questions, which I'll club them. One is obvious question: why isn't India testing it to the full capacity? Where are we going wrong, and why is the government refusing to test, despite knowing the fact that they're way behind when it comes to other countries? The other question, in line with the COVID, is what is going to happen post 20th? With the fact that many daily wage laborers are stranded, migrants, with the travel lines possibly opening up for them, will that increase the risk of infection? So when will it all be see flattening the curve?
Yeah, what's tragic to me as a former professional, good or bad, policies are set by somebody. What's frustrating and tragic for me is when the intended policy and the action are so divergent, right? If the goal was social distancing and lockdown as a way of flattening or whatever, hammering the curve, then the actions that the government has taken at both the Tamil Nadu level where I operate and at the national level have not actually, have been counterproductive. You give such little notice and you bring millions or tens of millions of people into disarray. And why are we surprised that we have at Kodambakkam, for example, a massive crush? Surely a government that was intending to shut down should have said, what number of extra buses do I run for Pongal and Deepavali that I shut down my local routes and run long distance routes? Let me at least run that. Now, I don't want to make this politics. I'm just trying to say that the intended outcome of a policy and the execution of that policy have been so divergent, whether it is Tamil Nadu or whether it's India, that we have seen in some sense worse crowding and worse aggregation on the 22nd, on the 24th, on the 5th of April, and so forth. The whole point of isolation was lost. If you were trying to prevent community spread, well, you just lost that. So now you say, how long do you keep on extending this, and how do you make sure that this doesn't happen? Because the longer you extend it, the more people are unlikely to stay contained. They say, I have to go buy vegetables. I have to go buy, now I need a haircut. Like me personally, at some point I need a haircut. Of course, I'm not going to violate the law for the sake of a haircut, but I'm saying essential services are going to become more and more kind of unmissable. And so with every passing day, you are going to increase the likelihood that your intent is going to be thwarted by the actions of people on the street. And of course, the economic consequences of every passing day. Just think about it. So let's let me just give you 3 data points. Let's say that we shut down as originally Tamil Nadu intended, where we said we're going to shut down on 24th and reopen on 31st. To me, 90% plus of employers could have afforded a 7-day shutdown. Say, okay, I'm paying this guy for a month's work and he's only worked 24 days. Yeah, it's some kind of loss. I'm going to lose revenue, but I'll be a nice guy and I'll pay all 31 days' wages. Now you say, no, it's no longer 7 days, it's 21 days. Now you say, okay, March is a loss. I've paid a guy for 31 days where he worked only 24 days. April, oh, now a second double whammy. Whatever I lost was 1/4 of the month's work and revenue there, but full cost. Here I'm going to lose half my revenue and still pay full wage. Maybe some guys pay full wage, some guys pay half wage, some guys, try to manage. Now you push it to the end of April. In my opinion, 50% of the MSMEs are going to have difficulty finding liquidity to pay full wages for a month of April when their revenue was zero, and some of their fixed costs like rent or EMIs or inventory carrying cost was not adjustable down to zero. So every passing day and every cycle, not every day is equal day. Every pay cycle or every inventory cycle or every accounting cycle increases the stress exponentially. So I just don't understand how this plays out, right? Because were you to suddenly lift, I've said this before, in a system like India, you can't go from 0 to 100 or 100 to 0 instantaneously. I used to do a bit of sailing back in the day at MIT. If you have a 40-foot boat and you decide you want to come to a stop, you got to decide, let's say, X distance. If you have a 50-foot boat, you have to decide at like 1.5 or 2X distance, not only 20% more distance, because the inertia of the boat is higher. So you have a system, the scale of India. If Singapore needs 4 days to shut down, India needs 10 or 20 days, right? You do it on 4 hours notice, you're going to get the perverse outcomes that you never intended. So I don't understand, unless you have a graduated lifting plan, I don't understand how the day of lifting is not going to negate all the consequences of your social isolation for 20 days or 40 days.
Where do you see relationship with USA the next few years? I'll probably extrapolate. How's India's relationship going to be with China, and how's world's relationship is going to be with China, and what is going to happen to China's ambitious Belt Road Initiative? Because I've worked quite a lot on the Belt Road Initiative and policy. I'm personally curious to know where it's heading as well.
I'm not qualified to answer all those questions. I'll just give one thought that comes to my head. 100% of a lot of these questions will start with the fundamental issue. How is the relationship of China with the rest of the world going to change? Whether you like it or not, China is the manufacturer of the world. Every supply chain in every product in every country is somehow linked to China. If China's relationship to the world is determined, at a skew of 15 degrees, then the rest we'll figure out from that. So I have no answer to your questions. I would only say that all of the answers are based on the fundamental answer. How is China's relationship with the world going to be, with the world as a whole? Of course, individual trading countries, but I think it's going to be more China relative to the world relationship for 2 reasons. China was the manufacturing hub of the world before it started, and it's not likely you can change those things on a dime. And whether you like it or not, China was the place where the virus originated, not just this one, but multiple ones before it. So, some people may start getting once bitten, twice shy, or twice bitten, thrice shy. Some people may say, but memories are short. The markets always forget after a year. Who knows? So I think the most important question is the China to the rest of the world relationship.
Just a single word answer. Are we seeing the end of neoliberalism? Yes, no?
I can't tell. No idea. I don't
Okay.
know.
Mr. Riaz, you can go ahead and voice your question to Dr. PTR.
Yeah. Hello, sir. My name is Ria. My question to you is regarding the MSME sector. What do you think about the availability of finance post this COVID situation? Will we see a reduction in lending or borrowing rates from the Indian banks? Will there be enough liquidity to give a stimulus, or will the banks be already having a crisis given the higher number of NPAs and the moratoriums which they have to give? Will we be seeing any light at the end of the tunnel post this COVID?
Sir, I think your question and your answer are there in the sense that I don't think anybody would disagree that the banking sector as a whole was in great distress before this whole crisis came about. I would personally say, and I say this quantitatively, I don't say this by politics, I would quantitatively say that this government has tried to do the easy thing, which is to take broad strokes and help out the large corporates and the taxpayers. Almost every action it has taken in the last, um, year, let's say, has been to support either the corporate tax cut, the tax cut for those paying income tax, which are already the top 5 or 8 or 10% of the country, even including increasing the excise taxes when oil prices fell, is a direct kind of regressive measure because it helps, rich people put much less of their income into excise and VAT taxable petrol and diesel than poor people do. So this government's priorities have been much more, and it's statistically proven. If you go and look at 2014, the OECD benchmark for fair taxation is 60% direct and 40% indirect. Direct meaning I know who I'm taking it from, so I can make it progressive. The richer you are, the greater tax you pay, and 40% because you're getting it from a larger base, so you take it in VAT, sales tax, excise, etc. We were at something like 52-48 in 2014. We have reversed now. We are something like 40% direct and 60% indirect now. So already the system was geared towards the easy solution and the kind of upper end of the system. It was as supply-sided economic philosophy as I've ever seen anywhere in the world. And that led to a lot of serious consequences. Now, my worry is that this government has shown no kind of nuance, shown no understanding of the complexity. I'll give you the Tamil Nadu data. Every year in the budget, the government of Tamil Nadu comes and presents how many small-scale industries are employing what capital, and how many, deploying how much capital and employing how many people. Something like 80% of all employees in Tamil Nadu work for MSME sector and very little work for the organized sector. In the MSME sector, 1.7 lakhs of capital creates one job. In the global investor meets that the government of Tamil Nadu has run 2 times, even their targeted number is 28 lakh rupees of capital per job created. Now, I understand that a multinational Ford coming and setting up is a different kind of job than a MSME, Kirana shop employee. I understand that. But I'm saying, should I be focused on creating one multinational white collar job or blue collar manufacturing line job, which takes, like 15 times the capital of creating an MSME job? To me, the biggest problem we have in the country is lack of employment. We are not able to get enough of our youth into the employment employment which makes them productive and makes them members of society with a stake, and less crime, less violence, all these other things. So I'm a bit concerned that these are all difficult things. It's much easier for me to announce 2 global investor meets than for me to go and set up business facilitation cells and clean up the kind of rent-seeking corruption behavior at every district center to support small businesses. So obviously all governments want to take the easy route. But taking the easy route for so long has made it such an unfair, unequal, biased kind of system that I fear that unless the government now doubles and triples up its efforts, we are going to have serious crisis in the MSME sector, because the banks, as you say, as I know, are very badly hit. They are not in a position to do this. And ironically, because they are public sector banks, and because they have, what do you say, targeted lending and political interference and stuff, they also find it easier to do one big 1,000 crore or 2,000 crore syndicated loan than to do, 5,000, 50 lakh loans. So that's really where our structural problem is.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Pete. Yeah, I could see there are quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box, but unfortunately, we're extremely running short of time, and I'm afraid we won't be in a position to take up these questions. But at least I'm sure we will have Dr. PTR hopefully after the AC, after the Corona era, and then probably reflecting on his crystal ball gazing. In fact, on a lighter note, a think tank is named Global Tax Laboratory. But obviously, we wanted to have the laboratory name on a different context. At no point in time we envisaged that this laboratory will be discussing about a pandemic. Maybe down the line, probably can share to our grandchildren that this laboratory also discussed and tested about COVID-19. Nevertheless, thank you, Dr. PTR, for a very very insightful analysis, and thanks for gazing into the crystal ball. To all those who are signing off, we kindly request you to leave your feedback on the technical experience, because this is the first time we moved to a different platform, largely due to privacy issues. But we could see there are some technical glitches. So if your feedback will be really appreciated. We'll also pass it on to Zoho for their betterment and improvement as well. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your time for spending during this lockdown and listening to the aftermath and economic effects of the great lockdown. Good night. Stay safe, stay healthy. We will connect soon again on another intriguing dialogue. Thank you very much to all. Thank you very much, Dr. Pitya. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.